also present an introduction for departments and programs here that Bethany is around, and chat with her. She's hanging out on the 15th floor, Farm Lab, and we'll be happy to continue on with that. But I met Bethany when we were in graduate school and had reached out about wanting to make some measurements at one of our research sites. And I was like, okay, you exist. It's far away, but and you work pretty independently up there, making a whole bunch of really cool water cycle measurements using cameras and sat flux sensors and trees and all sorts of fun stuff. And it's been fun to watch you progress from there to what you're working on today. So Bethany, before that, did get her undergraduate degree at Ohio Northern University in environmental studies, and then when I had met her, she was working on her PhD at Notre Dame, where she conducted work on land use and forestry, and got a PhD in biology. And then she's been doing her postdoc work with Carl Bernacki, who's another Flux Tower colleague of mine out at the University of Illinois. And the work that they've been doing down there has been some really interesting analyses using a variety of measurements and models to understand what are the climate benefits of bioenergy feedback. So thinking not just about growing bioenergy crops, which are used for fuel, but what are the ecosystem and atmospheric impacts of those. So I think we'll hear a little bit about that work today, including what I've gathered relatively hot off the press results. And stick around if you have time. I think we'll be heading over to the set for a beer or two after the talk, so if you want to follow up, please do so. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Tucker. How's the audio? Good, there? Yeah. Awesome. Okay, well, I like to start all of my talks by acknowledging the people involved. So I'll start with some acknowledgements. So as Ankur mentioned, I'm working with Carl Bernacki in his lab at the University of Illinois. And I was initially feeling a little bit intimidated about giving a seminar as one of the more early career people on the roster. But this work that I'm talking about is actually the work of many postdocs over a lot of years. So Carl set up these towers in 2008, and the project has been run, passed off hand to hand from Marcelo Nazari to Jesse Miller to Eva Ju, with some gap filling from Andy Van Lucke, Maria Gomez Costaneves, and Mirzamon Hussain. I first heard about this work from Caitlin Moore, who some of you may know, and who was my immediate predecessor on this work. She inherited this project in 2016, and actually did some really invaluable work getting everything organized, processed the same way, and standardized so that something like what I'm about to show you, like a 16-year analysis of these flux tower measurements, is possible. So in 2020, Caitlin handed the work off to me. We had learned through, I guess, Caitlin's foresight that it works a lot better if you have both a postdoc to do the science and a technician to help with some of the day-to-day of running the Flux Tower. So I also want to acknowledge Taylor Peterson, who has been absolutely invaluable in making sure these measurements come in continuously and come in well. So most of you are probably familiar with the general concept of bioenergy. You've seen the 10% ethanol stickers on the gas pumps. And theoretically, this is how it works. So you have a plant in the field. It consumes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. That plant is then harvested and goes through several conversion and distribution steps to become fuel, ethanol, and then that fuel is burned by cars or any other capable vehicle. And theoretically, all of the carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere from the end use, from the fuel use of vehicles, came out of the atmosphere the year before. So that the only real emissions associated with bioenergy use is everything that happened in the middle, what it took to get from corn in the field to fuel in the car. So in the United States, pretty much all of our bioenergy in use right now is maize ethanol. So maize is harvested as usual. The combine is ground into a fine flour, fermented to produce ethanol, and then ethanol is used as fuel. And the use of maize ethanol really took off in sort of the early aughts and early 2010s. This is from the USDA, looking at both the total production of corn and the amount used for ethanol. You can see is a big ramp up between about 2002, maybe 2011. But the thing about using a bunch of corn for ethanol is that you need a lot of corn. So corn is also used for food directly and as feed for animals. And if you need corn for both food and fuel, you either have to displace food, which has a number of economic consequences, or you have to grow more corn. And that in itself can have detrimental impacts on the environment by increasing the amount of land that's used as cropland instead of, say, pasture or forest or grassland. One strategy for avoiding these negative effects is to use something else to produce ethanol. This is what most of this talk is going to be about, is what I'm going to call alternative feedstocks. So this here is an example of an alternative feedstock. It's miscanthus. It's a productive perennial grass. Generally, for an alternative feedstock, you may want something that's more productive than corn, so that you're getting more bang for your buck, so more fuel for your acre. You may want to grow them somewhere where corn can't grow, so that you're not competing with land used for corn production for food, and instead using land that's not much good for anything else. You may want something that requires less management inputs, so that you have less emissions in that transition between crops in the field and fuel. Or you may want something that provides environmental cobenefits, or that is positive environmental effects by existing and growing on the landscape. There are a bunch of possibilities for what these effects might be. You might see improvement in water quality from reduction in fertilizer use, for instance. There might be contributions to biodiversity by creation of habitat. And in this figure, you can see that not only is there a lot of variability in these possible cobenefits, but it also is really sensitive to feedstock choice. So if you look at, say, annual crops, the trade-offs, so the bad things they're doing to the environment, are stronger than the benefits, and vice versa for something like perennial grasses in this particular study. One particular category of these cobenefits that's received more attention lately as interest in natural climate solutions and carbon crediting is increasing is using bioenergy crops to store carbon. That adds one more arrow to the sort of idealized bioenergy life cycle. You not only have corn growing in the field, but that corn or miscanthus or whatever is building soil and storing carbon for the medium to long term, pulling it out of the atmosphere. That happens when, this carbon storage happens when plants invest in below ground structures, could be rhizomes or roots. Those either feed the soil microbiota or decompose it completely and build soil, storing carbon there for the longer term. Theoretically, and actual research has borne this out, the more a plant invests in its below ground structures, the more capacity it has to store carbon in general. So if you use a plant that invests more in below ground structures, we use the switchgrass here in this example, then you're more likely to build soil. So another important climatic effect that any feedstock might have is the effect on surface energy balance. A lot of work has shown that these kind of surface energy balance effects can be as strong as the effects of storing carbon. Although that's more often the case for drastic land cover changes, say between forest and farmland. Different feedstocks have different technologies that may in fact impact the way it exchanges energy with the atmosphere. So for instance, we might expect this perennial crop to behave more like a grassland. It's got some kind of plant cover earlier and later. There's stalks and detritus on the ground throughout the winter, versus annual crop just looks more like wheat to me, but if we say corn, it's just going to be snow covered in the winter and then bare soil in the spring and fall, and really only green for a fairly short period of time in the middle of the season. Since both these things, both the effect of carbon cycling and the effect on surface energy balance, are part of how land use affects climate, it's important to evaluate both when considering feedstocks. Okay, so now we get to the actual work. So first, this whole slide just for orientation. All right, So just to orient you, we're in Illinois. It's a great state, one state south of here. Importantly, that means that we are not studying crops on marginal land, so this is land where corn can grow. We're not using any irrigation. There aren't any particular concerns about water use here. It's warm enough that grass crops are more productive than tree crops, for instance, short rotation willow. And for the rest of the talk, I'm going to be counting carbons and watts sort of within the field border. So there are a lot of sort of downstream ways in which a feedstock might affect climate through the consumption of fossil fuels for conversion. It might be that one feedstock is easier to adopt than another. All these are really important questions, but I'm an ecophysiologist, not an economist, and ecophysiological questions are certainly big enough. So way back in 2008, there was some interest in these alternative feedstocks from the Energy Biosciences Institute. Carl decided to set up some flux towers, contrasting several different feedstocks here. I want to highlight that some of these say 2020. This is just a slightly outdated figure. Everything that says 2020 is still running today. I'm assuming most of you know what a flux tower is, but in case you're unfamiliar, here's what one looks like in row crop. I believe this is our sorghum field. So it's got two main parts. One is the eddy covariance instruments, which are measuring the flow of carbon and water and energy between the surface and the atmosphere. And one is the meteorological tower, which is measuring things that might affect that flow of carbon, water, and energy between the surface and the atmosphere, things like how sunny it is, the temperature, and the humidity. Pardon my typo there. We are observing the carbon fluxes, the water fluxes, the energy fluxes in each of these fields for 5 different feedstocks. Maize, which is grown in rotation with soy, miscanthus, switchgrass, native prairie, and most recently sorghum. And I'm going to go into some detail about all of these feedstocks next. Okay, so starting with like the OG, corn. You probably all know what corn is. It's a pretty familiar Midwestern crop. It's annual. At our field, it's planted in rotation with soy. It's tilled in the spring and fall, and it's harvested in approximately October, and that harvest can be used for food or fuel. Every 3rd year, we plant those fields with soy, which we're also probably familiar with. It's also tilled in spring and fall, and then harvested for grain in the fall. So here's the next sort of squad, perennial grasses. So there are 3 perennial grasses that we're studying here, or I guess 3 sort of grassland ecosystems. One being miscanthus, which is a grass hybrid, quote unquote native, both of its progenitors are native, to temperate Eurasia. It is sterile, so it doesn't have the invasive concerns of some like garden miscanthus. One is switchgrass, that one's actually native to North America. And one is an attempt to replicate, the Illinois native prairie, so diverse grasses, forbs, and manage to maintain that sort of natural land cover. All 3 are perennials. That means they grow back from below ground structures each year. They don't need to be replanted each year. None of them are tilled, and all 3 are harvested for biomass because they don't produce any grain. It's not a useful amount of grain. Okay, so finally there's a new kid on the block, sorghum. So bioenergy sorghum is a photoperiod insensitive cultivar that never produces grain, or at least doesn't produce grain within the course of the typical growing season. Aside from that, it's managed almost exactly like corn, and that's important because it's easier for farmers or other land managers to switch between the 2. They don't have to learn new skills. They're not locked into a perennial grass for 10 years. It's planted annually. It's tilled in spring and fall. It is harvested a little bit later than corn, and it's harvested green. So instead of drying out in the field the way corn would, it's harvested green, dried out afterward, and then used for fuel. Just like corn, it's grown in rotation with soy at our sites every 3rd year. We've met soy before, so those 2 ecosystems are pretty similar. Okay, so here is the full flux data set. We have each of the feedstocks over here on the other, so you can remember what they look like. This plot is the years from 2008 when the towers were established to 2022. And each of these indicates the range that we have data for. So starting in 2008, the lab established 4 flux towers, one in maize, one in miscanthus, one in switchgrass, and one in native prairie. In 2017, there was a significant shift in the management of this site. An experiment was started to apply basalt to maize and miscanthus to increase chemical weathering. The switchgrass and native prairie systems were decommissioned, and the sorghum site was established because sorghum was sort of coming onto the scene as an alternative bioenergy feedstock. So, from this data set, I'm going to talk through the implications for carbon cycling, for net radiation balance, specifically in terms of albedo, and for heat fluxes, heat partition between latent and sensible heat. Okay, so starting with carbon. Many of you may know this, but a brief overview on how ecosystem carbon cycling works. During the growing season, carbon dioxide is going into the surface through photosynthesis, while this grows primary conductivity. It's also going out of the land surface through ecosystem respiration. The sum of those two, and what the Flux Tower actually measures, is net ecosystem productivity, or sometimes called net ecosystem exchange. And net ecosystem productivity is what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this talk, solely for time, because we would spend hours here if I try to go into the details of partitioning and exactly why each problem is fluxing the way it was. But I'm interested in the implications of why they flux the way they are, so we're going to talk about net ecosystem productivity. So the annual cycle of net ecosystem productivity in an agricultural system looks kind of like this. This plot is technically from a no-till experiment, if you were curious. The blue line is no-till and the orange line is tilled. That's irrelevant to the rest of this talk. This is used solely as an example. So in the rest of these plots about carbon, numbers above 0 means carbon is being released to the atmosphere, and numbers below 0 mean that carbon is being stored in the land surface. In the early season, there's not much photosynthesis, there's no crops in the field, but of course soil respiration is occurring, so some carbon is being lost to the atmosphere. There's a big carbon drawdown throughout the growing season as photosynthesis switches on and the plants grow. And then some partial loss of that fixed carbon through respiration as photosynthesis dials down and the plants end their year. Okay, so looking at carbon fluxes over time. Now I'm blocking out the legend here, just so that I can explain the plot before we go into what each bit of it means. So in this plot, above 0 is flux in the atmosphere, below 0 is flux into the land. And then this is that same squiggle that was on the previous slides. There's sort of the early season, where you've got a little bit of loss of carbon, big drawdown in the mid-season, a little loss of carbon at the end of the season. Importantly, in agricultural systems, there's a sort of third carbon flux, and that's the carbon that goes out through harvest. So at the end of the growing season, a tractor comes through, cuts down all the plants, and then takes all that carbon out of the ecosystem, and we assume that it is decomposed or burned or turned into fuel or eaten. We assume that it goes back into the atmosphere. So that's why you're seeing these little hops every year. Each year some carbon is stored, and then some portion of that carbon, but not all of it, is removed through harvest. As a result, the sort of net annual carbon storage is like the difference between the January 1st of 2 years. And in this particular example, it's about 1 or 2 tons of carbon per hectare. All right, so here's the actual results. The first thing that jumps out is that maize 1, our initial maize tower, is a very consistent carbon source. It's a carbon source almost every year, and by the end of the time period, it's released some 30 tons of carbon per hectare to the atmosphere. Conversely, the dark blue line, our original miscanthus 1 tower, is a very consistent carbon sink. It is consuming carbon each year. Less carbon than is consumed is removed. Presumably, the difference is stored in below ground structures in the topsoil. And then by the end of the period, it stored some 40 tons of carbon per hectare. Switchgrass is kind of in the middle. Native prairie actually, surprisingly, is a really strong carbon sink. So native prairie is about as strong carbon sink as miscanthus. And switchgrass is kind of in the middle. Then for the second phase of the experiment, remember in 2017 everything sort of shifted. We sort of have copies. So second phase maize is kind of bouncing around zero. It's hard to tell exactly what it's doing here. Haven't been enough years, and a little bit hard to tell by eye. But second phase miscanthus, immediately a pretty strong carbon sink. Sorghum, much like second phase maize. It's kind of bouncing around zero. Maybe it's a source, maybe it's a sink. Not super clear from this plot. But can visualize this a little bit more concisely. So in this series of plots that I'm going to show you, each of these boxes is like, it consists of like multiple years of data. So each year is, or the total carbon flux for each year is like one dot in each of these box plots. As always, negative numbers carbon sinks, positive numbers carbon source. This includes carbon deducted from harvest. And again, we're not talking about fuel production or farming inputs. It's slowly what's happening in the ecosystem. So for 2008 to 2016, miscanthus, prairie, and switchgrass are all carbon sinks. Miscanthus and prairie about equally strong carbon sinks, and switchgrass a little bit weaker. Maize, carbon source, very consistent carbon source. For 2017 to 2021, the second phase of the experiment, miscanthus continues to be a carbon sink. It is now through its establishment phase, where its productivity is a little bit lower, so it's an increasingly strong carbon sink. And the second phase miscanthus 2 field, is also a carbon sink, but with more of that variability because of establishment. Again, both maizes and sorghum, carbon sources. For both phases, the 2008 and the 2017, so it's kind of in the middle, pretty near zero for both of them. So putting all the years together, which I realize is statistically irresponsible, but is visually very clear, the perennial crops are generally sinks, miscanthus being the strongest sink. Annual crops are generally sources, and the variability is kind of similar. There's not a huge difference in variability in source of sink strength between really any of the different feedstocks. So one other thing to consider here is the yield. So of course we have a third carbon flux here, the carbon going out in yield. And yield can be kind of, you can think of it as like a bad thing or a good thing, depending on if you think of this as like an ecosystem, in which case yield is carbon going into the atmosphere, or if you're thinking of this as a fossil fuel displacer, in which case yield is displacing fossil fuels. Regardless of the way you think about yield, a couple of things are relevant. So sorghum and maize have pretty similar overall carbon fluxes, but that is in part because sorghum is losing a lot more carbon to yield. So sorghum yield is higher than maize. It means a lot more carbons are going out of the atmosphere for sorghum than for maize. But this is a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison, because if you remember, maize is harvested for grain and sorghum is harvested for biomass. So for maize, we're talking about only the carbon going out in grain, and for sorghum, it's the entire plant. Native prairie and miscanthus are much more of a sort of apples-to-apples comparison, since both are harvested for biomass. Similar carbon fluxes for both, but miscanthus yields more than twice as much as native prairie. Okay, so some sort of takeaways from carbon. So at the field border, not considering any of these farming inputs, etc., dedicated perennial feedstocks, miscanthus, switchgrass, and native prairie are carbon sinks, and annuals are carbon sources. However, there are some significant differences in exported carbon through harvest that contribute to those differences in net ecosystem production. Okay, phase 2, radiation. Okay, so I have established now that more or less, very straightforwardly, perennials are carbon sinks and annuals are carbon sources. But of course, I opened this talk saying, well, let's also think about the energy balance. So many of you probably know this equation. This is sort of basic surface energy balance equation. On one side is net radiation. That's how much solar energy is getting absorbed by the surface. And then on the other side are the turbulent fluxes, which is what happens to that energy once it's absorbed. And I am going to talk here about net radiation, and particularly how albedo affects net radiation. You probably have an intuitive grasp of how albedo works. So a lower albedo or darker surface absorbs more sunlight and is therefore warmer. A higher albedo or lighter surface absorbs less sunlight and is therefore cooler. So here's how this shakes out for these bioenergy feedstocks. So in this main plot, it's much like the plot for carbon, but instead of doing a single box for each year, we have a box for each month. So each of these are kind of like the trace of how albedo is changing throughout the year. And then from that trace, on average, I calculated radiator forcing, which is the actual cooling or warming effect of, importantly, the conversion from maize to a given feedstock. Radiator forcing only happens when something changes. So you can see generally here there's not, except in the winter where there's a lot of variability probably due to snow cover, there's not a lot of albedo variability within feedstocks. So the bars are pretty small. May corn is always about this level without a lot of variability between years. Perennials are higher in albedo for most of the year, especially in the spring and in the late fall. And this sort of theoretical conversion to perennials results in radiative cooling because they have higher albedos, while a theoretical conversion to sorghum results in radiative warming. However, there's a little bit of a snarl here with sorghum. So you can see the largest differences between sorghum and maize are here in like April, where really neither plant should be growing in the field. Both of these plants should be, bare soil in those fields at that time. So we think, me being Carl and I, that there's a difference in soil color there that may be influencing these measurements. And we do plan to make specific soil color measurements this coming growing season, but had decided, at least for now, to leave the data, how the data came in, and test our hypothesis in the future. So take this huge positive radiative forcing with sorghum with a grain of salt. That might be a sort of location-specific effect. Okay, so can we compare the two? Maybe. So the effect of albedo can be sort of imperfectly expressed as carbon equivalents by converting to radiator forcing. Again, some unclear exactly what the backgrounds are of everyone in this room, but someone has probably heard of this, carbon equivalents. I calculated two sort of versions of carbon equivalents for the albedo change from maize to each of the 4 alternative feedstocks. These were the results. So for the perennial grasses, the albedo increase from the conversion from maize was about as strong as a one-time carbon sink of 50 to 75 megagrams of carbon dioxide, carbon per hectare. And there was like a small, carbon equivalent source for sorghum, but again, take that with a grain of salt, that might be the soil color effect. Compare here actually the actual annual carbon dioxide sink for conversion from maize for each of these alternative feedstocks. So these numbers are going to look really different from the ones we saw earlier, which were like in the sort of 1 to 5 range, because first of all, they're in terms of carbon dioxide, not carbon, so there's some extra grams from those oxygens, and they're also expressed as a difference from maize. So for instance, this canthus is the sum of both the absence of the carbon source that maize creates and the additional carbon sink that this canthus creates. So it appears that the changes in albedo are much stronger than the changes in carbon dioxide, but albedo change happens once and carbon fluxes happen every year. So over sort of 100-year time horizon, the fact that for instance, miscanthus is sinking a ton or two of carbon every single year, greatly outweighs the effect of the change in albedo of that conversion. So quantitatively speaking, for switchgrass, the effect of albedo is about equivalent to 5 years of carbon sink difference from maize. For miscanthus, the same. For sorghum, about 2 years difference, and then of course maize is the reference, so converting from maize to maize would create low forces. All right, so having been through albedo, again we saw that perennials are sinks, annuals are sources, a lot has to do with yield, and then also that the effect of albedo is pretty small compared to the effect on carbon cycling. Okay, last but not least, talk about heat. So this is the other half of the energy balance equation. We've talked about net radiation, or at least part of net radiation, as controlled by albedo. But now we're going to talk about what happens to that energy once it's already absorbed. So energy absorbed by the surface can be partitioned into one of these 3 pools, plus some small pool for biochemical energy sinks. One is sensible heat, that's energy that warms the air. One is latent heat, that's the energy that's used to evaporate water. And then there's also ground heat, which is caused by conduction into the soil, but is more or less 0 on annual scales. So I'm not going to talk about ground heat in this talk. Intuitively, you can see the effect of heat partitioning when you think about the difference between the air over a grassy field and the air over, say, a bike lane. Both should have similar albedo, but because the grassy field is doing evapotranspiration, a lot of heat is getting partitioned in latent heat, and the air above the field is going to be cooler. Unlike albedo, changes in heat partitioning don't affect global climate. That energy is exported elsewhere. But of course, local climate can also be important. So for humans, we of course care about things like heat index, the combination of temperature and humidity. Of course, plants don't really care that much about the heat index. As long as there's enough moisture in the atmosphere and it's not absurdly hot, they're pretty much okay with that. But the amount of latent and sensible heat in the atmosphere affects how dry the atmosphere is, and that is something that plants care about. That dry atmosphere increases evaporative demand, increases stress, and could result in lower yields. Although the story for albedo and carbon came out like super clear and obvious, the story for latent sensible heat was not quite as straightforward. So this plot is a lot like the one you saw for albedo. So each box contains all of the years of that particular month. So for instance, this box includes average of all the Januaries from miscanthus. You can see there's a lot more variability here. To sort of assist the eye, I've done the sort of mean trace here in this inset plot. Generally, patterns of latent heat fluxes are reflected in phenology. Latent heat flux is peaking later in annual crops because annual crops take longer to get started. They have to start from 0, whereas perennial crops are usually establishing earlier in the spring. Between the annuals, sorghum is delayed by about a month relative to maize. It actually is a little bit slower to close its canopy, and it doesn't senesce. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, it's harvested green, so it stays green the whole time. So it's continuing to do evapotranspiration the whole time. And then finally, in the winter, maybe latent heat fluxes are a little bit higher in annual crops. My hypothesis is that has to do something with mulching. So the soil is totally bare in these annual crops and sort of very vulnerable to evaporation, whereas the soil is covered by a sort of layer of leaf litter in the perennial fields, which would insulate it insulate the water in the soil from evaporation. Sensible heat flux is actually even messier. So the fluxes don't divide neatly along perennial and annual lines. In the spring, miscanthus, maize, and sorghum have higher peat fluxes, sort of, in the late spring here. In the fall, it's prairie switchgrass and maize. Love to hear some input on why you think these are dividing out the way they are. In general, and I'm sort of being sensitive to time here, although there's not really like a super clear annual difference or even clear difference among feedstocks for latent and sensible heat, there are definitely differences in timing of when latent and sensible heat peaks. So in our current corn land, we have this massive peak of evapotranspiration here in July, which apparently causes something called corn sweats. But then when the corn is no longer contributing to evapotranspiration and get a drier atmosphere, that could contribute to atmospheric drought. So another possible hypothesis for future work is whether a patchwork of bioenergy crops rather than sort of massive regional maize monoculture might smooth out atmospheric humidity levels, reducing both peaks in humidity that are harmful to humans and lows in humidity that are harmful to plants. Okay, so final list of takeaways. Talked about carbon a few times. Local energy partitioning, not super clear differences among the feedstocks. They do seem to reflect some kind of difference in phenology that makes sense with the plant's life cycles. Maybe they are spreading out atmospheric moisture levels, but in general, the carbon and albedo effects are both much clearer and possibly stronger. All right, so final conclusions. So for all the feedstocks, a little bit unclear what's going on with peat partitioning. Relative to maize, perennial grasses did offer climatic benefits through carbon storage and higher albedos, although albedos weren't that important. In contrast, sorghum did not. Sorghum is basically corn, but higher yielding. And there's a little bit of subtlety here in that sorghum's advantages are kind of in the area that I have excluded from this study. Sorghum's advantages come from being easier to manage and from having a higher yield that may displace more fossil fuels. So to sort of understand where sorghum stands in this ranking, really we need a life cycle analysis to see whether the fact that it's less helpful in the field is maybe worth it because it's easier to turn into fuel. And all right, a few minutes early, that's me wrapped up. Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions.
Yeah.
I actually have two questions, but I'll ask the first one first.
Okay, that makes
so
sense.
how much does tillage play a role in? Half of Illinois is no-till maize, right, or soy, but all of your annuals are till.
That is correct.
Therefore, so I'm wondering if you do the carbon balance without the till, would the picture change?
I would hypothesize that it would. I guess in the example plots of tillage and no tillage, this is actually another long-running study that Carl has. The results, Carl has found in this particular study, also till and no till is a little bit controversial, so I'm trying to be careful here. But what Carl's particular study has found is that no-till, in fact, does store a lot more carbon. We can't really know because these towers are managed with tillage, and they have been managed with tillage the entire time. Generally, we're hesitant to change management because we want to be able to do something like this where we put all the years together and we say, here's the effect of the plant without having to parse out, well, it was managed this way this year and managed this way this year. But yeah, I guess to straightforwardly answer your question, I would hypothesize that the carbon balance for maize would be more favorable if they were not tilled. Yes.
I just wanted to follow up on the albedo effect because I got a little confused. So you're saying like you're changing from maize to albedo once, and then you from maize to miscanthus once, and then you keep the miscanthus, and so the effect is only like that initial change that's relevant?
Yeah, I really struggle to wrap my head around this
Okay.
because I thought probably what you're thinking is like, isn't that surface reflecting more light like every year after that.
Yeah, that was my question.
What I can say is that I calculated this 2 ways, got the same answer both ways, and I got a similar answer to previous work
Okay.
by Abraha. So it may be that the entire methodology is flawed, and frankly, if someone can explain this to me, please do. But yeah, I also share that confusion.
Yeah.
That's tricky too, right, because albedo is a local effect, CO2 is a global effect, right? So you can convert, like, I've never seen albedo converted to CO2 equivalents, so that's an interesting.
Well, it's the-
kind of wrapping my head around that.
Right.
Sure. It's the, it would be the change in net radiation converted to CO2 equivalents.
Right.
Albedo is the thing that mediates net radiation.
Right.
And in the initial plot, the difference didn't look that big, right? Like the one where the winter variance is really large and
Yeah, so
there
that's the other thing. They're all crops.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I can maybe find that, let me just close out of this so you can look at this. The differences in albedo are pretty small. If you look at the axis here, you know, we're ranging from like at the very lowest with like maybe anomalous sorghum 0.15, something like that, to the very highest without snow of 0.25, something like that. And the sort of relative unimportance of albedo relative to carbon, it was also found previously. It seems to be that I will be joining a consensus that albedo effects of bioenergy feedstocks are not as relevant as their effects on the carbon cycle.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm a political science undergrad, so this is all very, very out of my depth, but really interesting stuff. I was just wondering if there were any ongoing like outreach campaigns or policy proposals to kind of advocate for the usage of perennial grasses as a biofuel feedstock rather than maize, whether it's at the federal or state level. Like, is the ball rolling on anything like that?
Yeah, this is a major challenge for these alternative feedstocks, which is why I would caveat so hard on saying that these are the climatically favorable choice. They are in terms of land cover, but no one really wants to adopt them. There's a major gap in research addressing how to convert from the biomass to the fuel. So pretty easy to get ethanol out of grain, but the tissues that are used for the perennial grasses, for example, are a lot tougher and harder to break down, and they require a lot more energy. So that capacity needs to scale up, and you know, until that's there, the farmers really just don't want to grow it. There's not really a market for it. There is a local farmer that is growing it for turkey bedding, but surely we can't do a regional scale turkey bedding production. Yeah, so yeah, you identified a major challenge with that, which is why I'm carefully limiting myself to the ecophysiology.
So did you account for fertilizer?
Nope.
Yeah. That would be another possible.
Yep. So we're not counting we don't account for fertilizer, we're not accounting for, you know, the gas used to run the tractors or to ship we're just looking at this as a landscape. Yes?
What was the purpose of adding basalt to the maize?
Yeah, no one has been able to like super clearly articulate this to me. I think the idea is that the basalt is added to the soil and it somehow binds carbon into like the water or the soil. It's an attempt to do some kind of weathering, but it has no impact on the ecosystem as far as we can tell.
I don't think basalt is generally found in Illinois. I don't know.
It's not. No, it is. I've seen the pitch for this project a couple of times. It is a waste product apparently, so it's not something that's having to be produced, but it is having to be hauled. It doesn't really seem like it's doing much, but it's also the kind of thing that takes a long time to see whether it's doing much. So, maybe we'll tell you in 10 years. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious about how these individual species are sensitive to heat stresses, and then in a changing climate, whether we should be careful about planning how you grow this, like which one are more likely to survive.
Less
extreme heat
resilient.
stress.
Yeah, that's a whole other area of research that has kind of mixed results. Generally, the grasses are considered to be a little hardier than the annuals. In Illinois, we don't really have too much trouble with that kind of thing. It's pretty wet, it's not super warm. We do have trouble with storms. So for instance, sorghum is really prone to lodging and will get blown over, which will reduce the harvest. But since the establishment years, we really haven't had any sort of climatic events that were challenging to any of these crops. Pretty great place to grow crops.
It was more of a comment. So first of all, I appreciate the observational sort of work that you're doing. You made it look like it's very easy, but I understand that this is very messy work, so I appreciate that. And I also appreciate it because there has been a number of studies that use models to replace large areas with, blue corn, put perennial grass. But I could never get my head around them because depending on how you parameterize those models, you could pretty much get the kind of answers that you're looking for. And I think we all need the kind of observations that we're making, so I appreciate it.
Okay, well, great,
And
yes.
I hope that those modelers will
We
learn
do-
from your results.
We are, we work a lot with modelers, so probably twice a week I'm sending out some of these data sets to modelers. These data sets have really only been like cleaned up and usable in the last few years, mostly due to Caitlin's work, so we're foreseeing several publications that, are making use of this observational data to link both the modeling and observational frameworks. Yeah?
Sorry, I'm not an ecologist, but your carbon sink and your carbon releasing plants that you showed with the spring line over the years.
Yeah.
So I'm not aware of it, but is there a theoretical maximum to how much carbon can be stored in the soil? And if that's the case, do you expect like the effects of the sorghum to plateau over the years and maybe lose that, right?
Are you asking about like saturates?
Yeah.
It's an interesting question. I've never gotten it before. I would generally say no, but only because I know that the sort of really deep, rich soils that we have in Illinois are due to like hundreds of years of this sort of carbon sinking behavior from the natural riparian area. So if there's a theoretical maximum, we're pretty far from it, and frankly, through some poor management practices in the 19th and early 20th centuries, we've lost a ton of soil carbon. So there's a big hole to fill.